What is cultural globalization? What I perceive culture as is the shared repetitive actions of a certain group of people continued over time. The group will often assign arbitrary meaning to these actions in order to normalize them. It is this normalizing that makes the group of people feel at ease in their given society. Globalization is the movement and integration of ideas, goods, and people across the world. These two terms are symbiotic in my mind, as culture is primarily made up of ideas, goods, and people. Globalization is the phenomena that has distributed them around the world. But how do I fit into this complex puzzle of transnational cultural flows? This is a question that I've agonized over from the start of this assessment. How could I, a regular white Australian boy, have anything of significance to talk about when it comes to this topic? I speak English at home. A Vegemite sandwich chased down by a glass of Milo are the closest thing to my national cuisine. And the land that I occupy is technically not even mine. Despite all of this, here is a short history of how I've evolved into a global citizen, from an environment that perhaps did not facilitate it. Or in other words, how I have become not only a product of cultural globalization, but also an agent. To do this, I'll break down and analyze the three major parts of my life that I can adequately remember: primary school days, high school days, and young adulthood. But first, we must go back to my formative years growing up in the southern suburbs of Sydney. I grew up in the predominantly white enclave of Oatley, only moments away from the infamous Sutherland Shire. Growing up in this environment meant that I was fairly desensitized to what it was to be global. At my time during primary school, there was a sprinkling of other ethnicities. However, nothing to make me stop and think that there was a big wide world out there to be explored. My immediate surroundings as a child meant that I often heard the classic racial pejoratives to describe the others in our society. However, these other cultures were only relevant outside the confines of my little world. For me back then, I believed all Asian, Middle Eastern, and Southern European cultures were exactly the same. The nuances of culture had not yet filtered through. This was my local reality, and this is what was normal. Taking a step back to think about why my early perceptions of who the other were so two-dimensional is an important place to start. Why I perceived the things that I did relates to those who held the privilege of power in my reality. Traditionally, children always listen to their elders. It is part of almost any culture. This concept being quite Foucauldian in nature, that those who hold the power also hold the knowledge, and they exert their power by the passing down of knowledge. Subsequently, children are products of their environments and those they listen to. This is the first instance where I was a product of cultural globalization. Upon commencing high school, I was thrust into a whole new world of cultures. I attended high school in the neighbouring suburb of Hurstville, which is known for being a multicultural hub of the South. Whilst attending school, the cultures that used to be foreign to me became more prevalent. The schoolyard organically segregated itself into ethnicity for the first few years of high school. This was aided by the 2005 Connell riots being practically on our doorstep. The notion of Aussies versus Wogs became a very real thing. As high school progressed, ideas of racial conflict took a backseat to chasing girls and thinking of what was next. I left school in 2009 with a mildly greater worldview than when I arrived. Reflecting on this period of my life brings to light many important markers when it comes to thinking about how I was a product and agent of cultural globalization. This is where I believe the crossover began from solely being a product to having some influence as an agent. Bringing it firstly back to Foucault's knowledge and power paradigm, as I was gaining more knowledge about my surroundings, I was able to exert more power. Using Foucault as an overarching framework, Edward Said's concept of Orientalism definitely plays a major role in how I was obtaining my cultural knowledge at this time. In particular, the role of the media was playing in stereotyping and exoticizing the Middle East and the War on Terror. 2003 marked the first war of my lifetime, the invasion of Iraq by the US. Strong anti-Islamic rhetoric spewed from news outlets all across the world. Fast forward 2 years and turmoil brewed in Connell. At this time, the reporting of the Connell riots was being framed using a pro-nationalist voice. There was a general uneasy feeling of us versus them between non-Muslim and Muslim people. This quickly manifested itself in the minds of young white males, such as myself. Before, I was merely a product of cultural globalization given my limited experience and knowledge. But with my newfound knowledge, I was able to become an agent against cultural globalization and stand in solidarity with my Aussie brothers as a patriot protecting our land. This was all a result of mass media hype and hysteria. Moving into young adult life was quite a transition for me. After deferring university, I got a job in a warehouse in the western suburbs of Sydney. Western Sydney is an extremely multicultural place, and this warehouse was no exception. I began working alongside Tongans, Samoans, Indians, Sri Lankans, Fijians, Vietnamese, Chileans, Indonesians, Armenians, Filipinos, and Chinese, just to name a few. This first year working in that warehouse, I would attribute to the first formation of my global identity. For the first time in my life, I was able to explore other cultures in a more mature setting. By working with these people, I began to appreciate their worldviews, which in turn allowed me to formulate my own. I can draw parallels between my experiences of entering the multicultural workplace and sentiments Amanda Wise expressed in her article titled Hope and Belonging in a Multicultural Suburb. Wise talks about how shared mutual spaces within the community of Ashfield allow these different cultures to interact cohesively. The exact same thing can be seen in the workplace, as it breaks down boundaries and power struggles. Everyone is unified for a common purpose. I now consider myself a true global citizen. I have now travelled to 23 countries and across 3 continents. I've worked as a tour guide in Vietnam, a camp counselor in the USA, managed a hostel on a tropical Thai island, lived with a Mayan family in Guatemala, driven a rickshaw from Kochi to Jaisalmer in India, and I'm now a part owner of a tour company in Indonesia. I can now speak conversational Spanish, some French, and some Thai. And I can say some key phrases in Bahasa Indonesia, Burmese, and Vietnamese. A stark comparison to what I was 20 years ago. Despite being a pure product of cultural globalization at the beginning, time, knowledge, power, experience, media, different jobs, and experiences with those ethnically different to me have enabled me to evolve into an agent of globalization. Cultural globalization is forever changing and evolving, thus comparable to a journey. Ernest Hemingway once said, it is good to have an end to a journey, but it is the journey that matters in the end. Thank you.